Welcome to the Elokus podcast, and this is class number 10 in the discourse Lecha Anashim, which is the fifth discourse in the great book, Pshashak Dimu 5672. We are holding in the middle of chapter 19. This is class number 5 in chapter 19, so 10 in the overall book, and in the entire learning that we learned, it's class 101. Yesterday we made a big deal that it was class 100, but really, when it comes to the study that we're studying now, 101 is of greater significance, because the whole point of 100 is a certain perfection and a certain completion. And when we're dealing with studying the divine, the idea is always to sense that it's to know that no matter how much we know and how much we study, we know nothing, and that's expressed in 101. After the perfection, you go beyond it, and that's why this class is such a significant class. Here we go. So yesterday we were holding a middle of the discussion regarding fire and water, because we're trying to figure out the existence of the Esespheres Agnuzais, of the 10 hidden Sphirot, how they dwell, how they exist within the soul itself, or within the Ein Sof itself, and the same is regarding the Kochos HaNefesh, the powers of the soul. When they are in the soul itself, over there they don't add, there's no pluralism over there, there's no many in the soul, it's one power, and that's the soul itself. Yet, there is an existence of the 10 latter powers of the soul, or the 10 latter powers that are going to come out from God, is already existing in the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. And the question is, how do they exist in a perfect oneness, where on the one hand they exist, and they're contradictory one to each other, and yet they're totally one. So this is what we're trying to figure out. So yesterday we had a discussion about fire and water, and we discussed an amazing idea, and that is that there is essence and there is expression. And everything we see and experience, we experience the expression of it, but not the essence of it. The essence of it is what is not seen. Essence is not revealed. So when we look at something, we see its expression. So when you look at the essential element of fire and water, so we're seeing the expression of fire and water. And the expression of fire is that it's hot. And as we discussed yesterday, the expression of fire is that it's luminous. And the expression of water is that it's cold. But that's only the expression of fire and water. And therefore we can say that the conflicting elements between fire and water are only when it goes into expression. But when it is in a state of essence, as we discussed yesterday, the essence of fire is not hot. Because if the essence of fire would be hot and there's the element of fire in everything, then the world would be burnt by it. Because one thing is for sure, that the essence of something is more powerful than its expression. So if the heat of fire would be essential to the fire, which means it would be intrinsically at the very, 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 very quintessence of the fire would be the heat, then it means you can't have fire without the heat. That means that the element in its most essential form of fire would be heat, and it would be even hotter than an expressed fire. Then it would be a type of temperature that we don't even know. Imagine how hot, I don't know how hot fire is. Real fire, what's the heat of fire? It probably depends on how big the fire is. But in any case, what is the heat of fire? I'm not exactly sure. But the temperature of the essential fire would be way, way, way hotter, because the essence is always stronger than its expression. Then it would be that everything should be burnt. And yet we find, and we also learned yesterday, that the world should be always lit up with the fire that is surrounding the atmosphere. And yet neither it's lit up. There's nighttime when it's dark, and even when it's daytime, it's from the sun. It's not from the essential element of fire that's everywhere. And in addition to that, the world doesn't burn. So what do we see from here? That the essence of fire is not hot, and the essence of water is not cold. And for that reason, in essence, they can be together, although they are totally opposite. But yet they exist in a way where the fire is not hot and the water. In other words, so the heat of the fire and the coolness of the water is to say that's the tzior of fire. Tzior means that's the image of fire. That's the form that it takes when it comes into expression. That's the idea that he wants to explain. And therefore, fire and water can sit together in their essence in the same place. If they were to come out, remember the last word he said, if they were to emerge out into their form, into their expression, without diluting themselves, then the fire and the water would be so intense, you would never, ever, ever, ever bring them together. They would be impossible to unify. The reason we could unify fire and water, as we discussed yesterday, that there are ways of doing that, And that's because the fire, when it goes into a state of fire, gets weakened. When it goes into a state of expression, into a form of fire, it gets weakened. And the water, when it goes into a form of water, gets weakened. So even though two things happen, two opposites, on the one hand, they become conflicting forces then, because the fire becomes hot and the water becomes cold. So therefore they're in conflict with each other. But on the other hand, they're already weaker, so you could kind of bring some kind of a compromise between the two. You could facilitate some kind of a fusion between fire and water once they're coming to expression. But however, if we would have two strikes, what would the two strikes be, the two negatives? If fire would be, if the essence of fire, which is not hot, but when it would come into form, which is the heat of fire, and however we see fire, and the essence of the element of water, when it would come out with all of its ferociousness, with all of its potency, and it would come into coldness, it would be such a coldness that would be non-negotiable, and such a heat that would be non-negotiable. So I'd like to, and therefore they would never get along. But the way it works is like this. In essence, they can sit together because they're prior to form. So then they're not in conflict. And he says they're not integrated one with each other. They just can sit together in the same place. They don't bother each other. Because they're not in opposition. They're not at war with each other because they're beyond their shape and form. They're beyond their tzior. They're beyond the image of heat and cold. Let's call it like a garment. Fire hasn't put on the garment of heat, and water hasn't put on the garment of cold. So why should they fight against each other? Although they're opposites, because when the fire will emerge, it will always put on the hot garment, and the water will always put on the cold garment. That means that in essence they're very different. But at this point, because they're so mufshat, meaning they're so uncolored and untainted, that their oppositeness quality is not assertive, is not present, it's not noticed, and therefore the two can sit together. Like we discussed 2 days ago in the class, how Shammai and Hillel, when they're walking, when each one is receiving the idea from Shammai and Avtalion from their teachers. Initially, when they both hear the idea, even though they're essentially different in the comprehension, but you don't even notice how different they are, you can even assume that they're saying the same thing. And it's only later when each one goes off to create their own academy and their own school, and each one creates a whole force in this world, a whole energy, which is based on the subtle differences between one and the other. It becomes very, 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 very noticeable how different they are, and then they clash with each other. Okay, but on the other hand, he says, there is no hiskalalus, which means there is this arvus. They can mix with each other, but there's no hiskalalus, there's no integration. When they become expressed, there's no hisarvus. Fire is fire and water is water. Hisarvus means there's no mixing. However, over here there could be hiskalalus. There could be interaction because they become weaker. And when they become weaker, you can already create bridges. Let me explain that in a human experience, which I think will make the whole thing more comprehensible. So sometimes you have two people that, let's say if you have a shul, you can always see it, you have a community. You have people that are very, very different in their character. Completely different. And they don't see ever eye to eye. They have a whole complete different attitude to life. Their entire perception of reality is different. Their entire attitude is different. Their temperament is different. They're a complete different type of a person. Right? A lot of times these two people sit together in shul, in synagogue, or whatever. They sit together and they don't bother each other. They literally sit. They have two seats next to each other. The high holidays. The rabbi wants to keep the shul quiet, so he puts two people that are so opposite than each other sitting together. So they're not going to have a conversation because they have absolutely nothing in common. So they sit next to each other. They're not going to burn each other. They're not going to fight. Why? Because they're not expressing their ideas. They're both coming to shul to daven. They're daven. Even though one is like, today's days we're finding that when the world is so polarized, you have people that are like extreme conservatives, you have people that are extreme liberals, right? Two people, they think differently. The entire perception of the political understanding, everything is so a world of a difference. But as long as they're in a state of essence, they're not in a state of expression. They're not in a state of voicing their opinions. They're not asked to speak. They're just sitting together. Okay, so this one, each one minds their own business. They can sit right next to each other and they're not burnt. Again, there's no acid between them. There's no problem. However, if you start, and when I say they sit together, you can, hypothetically, one can sit on the other's lap too. It's just physically they can't be occupying the same space because that's not because of their difference of one being a conservative and one being a liberal. They can't sit together in one place, literally. They can't, because they're physical beings, and a physical being occupies space, and two physical beings can't occupy the same space. But in concept, they can be completely mixed with each other, although they're not integrated, but they can still share because there's no conflict in this muted state, in the state where they're not voicing their opinions. However, if you engage them in discussion, you sit down with them both, and you start a discussion about any element in life, bring up any situation. And then suddenly one is asked to voice his opinion, and the other one has to do an opinion, and suddenly before you know it, it's fire and water. It's nuclear war. It's literally intolerant one. And suddenly they can't sit together anymore. They're powerful. Why? Because even though, as they're silent were, even though they're complete different characters and complete different beings, you can bet earlier that they would have complete different, beforehand, before even you brought up the discussion, that they would react in a complete opposite form. Yet they're together because they're in a state of essence, and the essence doesn't burn each other. The essence is not an expression. When you get their expressions, that's when there's trouble. However, but watch this. Once each one voices their opinion, and they're fighting and screaming and shouting, and it's a bloody hell going on over there. There is something that can be done, and that is, if you have a good negotiator, if you have someone who's really, really good, you can listen to both of them, and they're shouting and they're screaming, but you can calm them down and kind of get each one's their opinion and their thoughts, their debate, their opposites. And slowly he can pick up on a little nuance, which one of them said, which is a little bit, in a sense, saying a little bit weak, a little bit of a weakness in their argument. They're fiery conservative, but there's a little weakness where they have a little bit of a little tiny bit of a liberal streak. The other fellow, listening to him, who's really liberal beyond liberal. But in there, you can sense there's one tinge where they hear. You can see that there's a little bit of a tinge where there's a little bit of conservative value. So the moderator. This is the moderator. This is the quality of a moderator. The moderator is able to pick up on where one is weak and leaves room, a tiny little room for the other one, and the other one is weak, and pick up on this point. And create a meeting point. From the whole thing, you both agree in this point. And from that point, they can try to build the bridge between the two opposites. Now, the reason you can do that is because they're talking, because they're expressing themselves. Because once the essence comes into expression, it's already weaker. And in that weakness, in other words, from the essential character of this one and this one, if you try to bridge him and create a fusion, there is no way, there is no fusion. Although they can sit next to each other for 100 years and not bother each other. That's because they're not expressing. But if they were to express their essence, if the essence would come out in expression, then you would never be able to even find the tiniest point, because in essence, this one is this type of person, this one is a very kind person, and this one is a very disciplined person, and therefore there is absolutely, in essence, no way to connect the two. They're as far as east and west. However, since when they express themselves, every expression is already a certain weakening. In other words, like each one is expressing their idea, you're articulating it through logic. Once you're introducing logic, logic is already weakening. Every logic, every sophisticated argument, in order for it has to sound, you want to sound normal, you want to sound like a total lunatic. So you kind of curb the intensity of where you're coming from. It gets a little bit diminished, it gets a little weaker. And it's in those weakening points that you can find one can tolerate the other and the other one can. That's the point of connection. And that's how you build bridges between opposites. That's how you make peace between countries, and that's how you make peace. When you bring people to the table, you cause them to sit down at a negotiation table, even though they have such extreme different views about everything. And that's where you find the points where everybody can agree on and start building. But that's only in the expression. From the expression, you can bring a peace. And even though essentially they're opposites, but in an expressed world, they can live together. So that's the difference between integration and mixing. The mixing element happens in essence. Essence, they can be mixed together. They can both sit together in the same room, and it's fine because they're not expressing. And because they're not expressing, they're not contradicting. And because they're not contradicting, they can be completely sharing the same space. However, once it comes into expression, there is complete contradiction. But precisely in that contradiction, because their essence is conveyed, because every gilui, because every revelation is going away from the essence, and it therefore gets weakened, and that weakening, that's where you can find points where they overlap one with each other, because of that weakening. And the integration can happen. That's the idea. Okay. The Inyan, that's what I'm going to go back to we're still holding in the middle of the parentheses of yesterday. The Inyan is Arvus, and when we say that the two, but here we're talking about the essence of fire and the essence of water. In other words, not the expression. When we say that they get along with each other because they're not, in essence, the contradictory properties of fire and water is in its expression. The Inyan is Arvus, and when we say that they are mixed, Ein zeh she'ein klulin zeh mizeh. This doesn't mean that they are incorporated one with the other. They live together. The fire is not on its own. The water is not on its own. Fire and water can occupy the same space. They can be completely together, and they're not poking each other. They're not triggering each other because there's nothing to trigger because they don't feel each other opposites. However, he says, this is not such a perfect example. He says because when we say that fire and water would get along perfectly, and they have no problem being together because their contradictory qualities is only in their expression, that is only because we are assuming that heat and cold are what make the two opposites. Because when we look at fire and when we look at water and we try to figure out what is the point of contention between them, why do they always fight? So we will come to the conclusion and say, because the fire is hot and the water is cold. And hot and cold are opposites. Either hot or cold, it can be both. Hot and cold are opposites, that's why they fight with each other. And therefore, what are we saying? That the heat of the fire, and we've already proven that the heat of the fire and the coolness of the water are not in their essence. It's only in their shape. So that will explain why in the essence they can get along. However, the Rebbe says, maybe it's not that way. Maybe, you're right, that way he's not going back that the heat of the fire and the water, that the heat is not in the essence and the coolness is not in the essence of the water. That he's not accepting that. But he's saying maybe fire and water are opposites, not just because of heat and cold. Maybe fire and water are opposite because they're opposite. Not just because of the heat element. In other words, it's not only due to their garment that fire dresses itself in hot and water dresses itself in cold. Maybe fire and water are opposite in who they are. And in that case, they're in conflict even before they open their mouth. They're essentially in conflict. And therefore, maybe this explanation is not such a good explanation. And he doesn't really, he doesn't answer that. He just makes that observation. Ach zehu, this is lafiyasa yasenu. This is according to our understanding, our grasp and our knowledge. We know, we are observing it from the outside. So we know, we know the conflicting elements of fire and water, the oppositeness of fire and water, rak. We know it. We can only we determine that is due to b'chaim v'kor, because of the heat and the coolness, kor and coldness. And we negate that from the essential powers, like we already explained earlier. He didn't really explain how we know that water is not cold, but he explained how we know that fire is not hot, because we know that the world is that if it would be hot, it would burn everything. But the main idea is, now again, he just said that on fire and water we can't really say that as a definite, but he's still holding on to the idea that he just explained. He says, what is the primary premise, which is going to be true about fire and water as well, and it's going to be true about everything. In other words, the example we gave about heat and cold is not necessarily the perfect example, because maybe there's something more to the opposition of fire and water on a deeper level. However, therefore, it doesn't negate the general concept. And he says, the main idea is that we are trying to, in order to resolve how things that are really opposite, but when they're still in their essential state, are not in conflict with each other. We're going to say, the idea of opposite qualities in any type of thing, is only in the expansion of things, which is always the image of something. And images, one image is one way, and the other, like we spoke the other day, there's a triangle, there's a square. There are two different images, and one is not the other, a circle or a triangle, two opposites, this way or that way. But the essence, since the essence is removed from any type of form, even though this is the essence of fire, it's the koach eish. We're not talking about the essence of reality prior to it being fire and water. We're talking about the power of fire when it's in its essence. And this is the power of water. They can live together, because any type of opposition will always be in the form. Okay, maybe it's not hot and cold. Maybe there's some other element even deeper than hot and cold that's conflicting, but that too is also in the form. The essence is beyond any form, and therefore it's not opposite one than the other. And that's what he continues to explain, how the existence of the 10 spheros, the powers of the soul in the soul, and the 10 spheros as they are in the Or Ein Sof, is in a state of essence, and therefore it's in a state of existence that is not in existence. It exists in a non-existent manner, like we discussed earlier. It's existing in a non-formulated manner. And that's why, like we discussed, and he proved from all the various different levels, even in levels way after the Tzimtzum, in Adam Kadmon and Akudim, we find already that they can exist in one vessel. It's all because of the Dakos. Remember we said Dakos and Ruchnias. Because they're so spiritual and so refined and so high, and so that's the reason why it's beyond all these descriptions. Okay. Now we're going to continue inside. Just a few lines. We're not going to learn too far. Just a little bit to continue. We finished with the parentheses, which we did in the last two classes. And we're going to go back to inside. This is on the bottom of page Lamed. Again, this is still in chapter 19. We're about halfway through chapter 19. We did one page, a little over a page, and now we're going further. But I'm just going to go back. We're holding by the words Lechein b'matan Torah. I just want to go back just for the flow of the Indian. We're going to go back a couple lines that we learned already. Ukamoiken. After we explained how the powers of the soul sit together in the soul because they're so refined and therefore they're not in conflict with each other. So he says, the same as also be regarding the 10 spheres. Again, we're looking at the 10 spheres while they're still embedded in the Or Ein Sof. Even though when they come into vessels, they do become very pronounced kindness and severity, separated one from the other. When they're still incorporated in the Or Ein Sof, they are in a state of such finitude, v'aruchnius, and so spiritual, le'en kates, infinitely higher, from the way they are once they come into expression in the vessels. That's why there's no division there. Each one should sit in its own. They're all, remember, not integrated, but rather they're all mixed together as one, and they can all sit in the exact same seat without any differentiation one from the other. And here's where we continue. Just another few lines. Now he's going to give us an experience, an experiential experience of that type of, because we experience everything in our own soul, in our own existence. Our entire consciousness and experience is always the powers of our soul when they're already vesseled. We don't experience the naked powers of our soul. We experience everything as they are already vesseled. We experience our intelligence when the power of intelligence is already in the vessel of the mind. We experience our emotions when it's already powered, when it's already settled into our physical, emotional vessels, which are the heart or whatever that is. So to have an experience where we experience the essence of our powers, and more than that, even if we are to experience an experience of pure soul, not inside vessels, like a soul that's outside of the body before it comes into a body. So it doesn't have a physical vessel. But even then, it still has the kalim of the soul. The soul also has kalim. The powers of the soul, there's the energy of the soul, and there is the what we might call the body of the soul. So it's also in vessels. A pure transcendental experience of energy when it's not in any vessel at all, and especially when it's still within the essence of the soul. We've never had that besides one time. When was that? We had that by the time of the giving of the Torah. That was such an extraordinary experience. By the giving of the Torah, since the essence of God was revealed, the essence of our souls were revealed. That the power of all of our kochos, all of our powers, were revealed to us while they're in the essence, not going out of the essence while they're still in their essence. And that's why everything went haywire. We heard the sights, and we saw the sounds, which means our power of hearing was seeing, and our power of seeing was hearing. So there was suddenly a complete contradictory function from our powers, which doesn't make any sense. Because each one, generally, sight is sight, and audio is, and hearing is hearing. And they're two different experiences, yet by the giving of the Torah, they were one. By the giving of the Torah, then there was a revelation from above. The Hishtalshalos means the order of evolution, where everything emerges, where each energy manifests itself in its own vessel and its own container and its own order, the orderly system, where there is a whole system. But here, everything was revealed from beyond the Hishtalshalos, ubenefesh, and as that's from God's end. That Hashem wasn't interacting with us from sphirot, from attributes. God himself emerged to the world. That's why it doesn't say any name. It's beyond name. Hashem introduces himself as Anochi, I am. Yes, then he comes through the names. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. But first is I am, God's very self. Ubenefesh. And how did we stand there to receive it? Also, we were standing at the giving of the Torah to receive God's essence from our essence, not from our sphirot, which means from our powers. So we're elevated into our essence. But when we're in our essence, it's not we were elevated into the essence in a place where there are no powers. We were elevated into the essence and where all the powers are as they are in the essence. Not to a place where all the powers are erased. Like we said earlier, God did not just say Anochi. He said Anochi Hashem Elokecha, which means there was names of God also pronounced, but the names as they are included and of one with the essence. And the same in our souls, we were then uplifted, all of our powers, into the experience of the powers as it is in the essence and of the essence. And therefore the souls in their most essential state, the powers of the soul in their most essential state, operating in their state of essence. And over there they do funny things. That's the idea. And in the soul, it's the revelation of the essential powers. And therefore, what happened? They cited the sounds, and they heard the sights. Vision and hearing were not divided. Now, this seems even more than what we were saying before. Before we were saying that in essence, they're not a contradiction. The fire and the water can both sit in the same seat without contradicting each other. But here we're going to see even more than that. They're actually acting in a way that is, we said earlier, the conservative is being liberal and the liberal is being conservative. They're doing the opposite, complete opposite of what they're doing. That he's going to explain in the parentheses we're holding right now, that this seems to be even more than that, how this is and what it is. This is getting really, really great. It's getting really, really exciting how we're going to move through this. So let's leave this Bezrat Hashem for next week's classes. Okay, meanwhile, let Mashiach be here today.